today we have with us Elena. She is a disability rights advocate and she's a researcher. She's done lots of work around rights of persons with disability. And she would be engaging us today on the UNCRPD, otherwise known as the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability, and of course, trending or topical issues when it comes to rights of persons with disability.
So I already got a wonderful introduction from Gladys. So my name is Elena Kale. I go by the pronouns she, her, which means that I identify as a woman. And I have a Bachelor of Arts in International Justice, which means that I went through the entire law degree program, but in the end didn't get a law degree. A Bachelor of Arts, and I did that at Leiden University. And I wrote my master's thesis on India's Mental Health Care Act 2017. So it's quite lovely that there's two people from India here today because that is my area of expertise. And I also have a Master of Science in Sociology of Law, which looks at how law is a social fact and looks at how law is used in society. And I have approximately 3 years of experience in human rights, both activism and research, and volunteering and actual work. And I also recently got on board on a mental health law podcast, which is called the Legal Wolf Podcast. And it has a lot of episodes. A lot of them are about health law, human rights law, any of that. As a quick disclaimer, there are a lot of terms which are used in this field of disability rights, which mean different things and refer to different things. So on the one hand, there's disability rights, which is about the rights of people who have some kind of disability to be not discriminated against, to be included in society. There's also the right to healthcare, which means that a person should be allowed to get healthcare, whatever is possible. So these are slightly different. There's also health law. Health law regulates the medical sector. And forensic law has to do with basically cutting people apart to obtain evidence at crime scenes. So all of these have to do with bodies, but they're all slightly different. And we are going to be talking about disability rights, which is on the left here. So our day today is divided into approximately 4 parts, plus a little break in the middle. I'm first going to introduce disabilities as a social construct rather than a medical construct. I'll then talk about the UNCRPD, which was the mouthful that Gladys had, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, quite long. Then we'll talk about reasonable accommodation and what that means, have our break, and talk about mental health care law, or legal capacity, mental capacity, that whole spiel, and talk about my thesis as well and my research. So there's a really, really cool book. It's a comic that I recommend reading. It has a nice overview on basically the life of a person with a disability. It's a comic that I think I sent Gladys the link so she can forward it to you. It's a super cool comic. And there's one explanation in it of different types of disability. There's, on the one hand, so-called congenital disability, which is something somebody has from birth onwards. There's also acquired disability, which means that a person had an accident or an injury or a disease and now have less capabilities. There's also intellectual disability, such as conditions affecting intellectual ability or mental capacity. That can be, for instance, Down syndrome. And invisible disability, which is chronic illness, mental illness, sensory or spectrum disorders, where autism, for instance, comes in, or of course, schizophrenia, depression, those types of things. And the comic in general has a bunch of cartoons like this, which is really cool if you're looking for an overview in an animated way, which isn't like a textbook. So I promised you that I would discuss the medical versus social idea of disability. So the understanding that most of us have had from start of our education onwards is that if you're disabled, then you have some kind of illness, something is less about you that can be diagnosed. You can go to a doctor, the doctor can say, well, this and this and this is wrong with you. And therefore, the people who are supposed to be responsible for disability are doctors, special educators, a very small elite specialized group. And disability policy here is all about curing, healing, getting treatment to help disabled people become as normal as possible. And this model is slowly becoming less popular because we've moved on to the idea that disability is a social construct in the sense that every person has a different body, and some, for some reason, are accepted as normal and others aren't. And society is built in a way where some people can manage really well, but others can't, and then somehow need more assistance. So the social model of disability is all about, well, okay, if a person can't get around, if they can't get on public transport, let's change public transport instead of the person. In the UNCRPD, so the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, they briefly define what disability is and say that it is an evolving concept that results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder full and effective participation in society. So the UN Convention says that disability isn't necessarily medical, but social. And can somebody here perhaps name something that would count as a disability if we didn't find a way to enable participation, but we found a way to support people so that we literally don't think of something as a disability anymore? It's a tough one, but you're looking right at it because I put a picture of glasses and people have problems with their vision. They can't really see well. But we found ways to help them by literally just putting a pair of glasses on their face and boom, problem solved, no longer a disability. The thing is that we often don't consider how people with disabilities or with different bodies struggle. And I found this Tumblr post from like years ago. And the Tumblr post says, if you want a nice body, go get it. If you want to become a lawyer, study your ass off. If you want nice hair, pick a style and get it done. Stop being afraid and motivate yourself. And then somebody responded to it, well, that is ableist. And ableism refers to this treating non-disabled people as the standard and thinking that everybody can just, if you try hard enough, you'll manage. This is a form of exclusion. This is a form of oppression. Because thinking that somebody can just, do something doesn't recognize that people have different abilities and people with disabilities will not be able to just get a nice body if they want to. So this is quite an ignorant statement. And in the disability rights movement, there's a huge fight against this so-called ableism. So moving on, we've got a bunch of lawyers in the room. So I'm going to go to the legal provisions and take a look at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCRPD. It was passed in 2008, so it's really, really, really new. And it has a bunch of provisions, some of which are about human rights values, just says again that everybody should live in dignity, etc. It summarizes and clarifies rights. So it doesn't add any new ones necessarily. It just clarifies that yes, there are human rights and they also apply to people with disabilities. It says that every person should have an access to resources and be included, and reminds about non-discrimination. So an interesting part about the UNCRPD is that it doesn't just reaffirm the rights of persons with disabilities, but says, for instance, if there's a mother and the mother has a child and the child has a disability and the mother needs to work from home, she's skipping work, she's about to get fired, then the employer would still have to protect her because she is the parent of a person with a disability. And now the big question, does the UNCRPD also apply to mental illness? If you go on Google, there's a bunch of questions like this. It is a bit of a trick question because exactly the UNCRPD, its point is to say human rights apply to everyone, to highlight that disability isn't just a category that a person is in or not, but that every person has different abilities and those should be accommodated. And there is a huge emphasis on non-discrimination. So literally, because the purpose of the entire convention is to highlight that people are not different and that therefore nobody should be discriminated against on the basis of disability. And when I first read this definition, I was like, this is interesting, because it really clarifies that discrimination, distinction, exclusion, restriction on the basis of disability, which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying equality. So if a person receives positive discrimination or some kind of assistance, that's good. That will help. But if it's any type of exclusion, restriction, that's discrimination and is prohibited. At the same time, we do have to think about what this means in practice. For instance, what about if a person is blind and is not able to see and doesn't get a driver's license and is not allowed in a car? Would that be discrimination? Would that be unfair? And this is something to think about, but there is a clear answer that it is not discrimination. Because discrimination is everything that does not make sense when you look at the facts. So the idea is that every single time we deal with a person, with another person, we shouldn't put them in a category, but we should base our assessment of what they're able to do on their actual abilities to perform a task. So instead of saying, oh, you're disabled, yeah, you're not able to drive, look at concretely what would not make them able to drive a car. And I love this little, very basic animation that I made here on the left of a little spectrum, which shows that people are all different and adapts differently. And there is a term called neurodiversity, and neurodiversity refers to the fact that people with mental disabilities or disabilities are not broken, but just have a less typical version of the many different types of human brains that exist out there. So instead of saying, we're going to just draw a line here in the middle and everybody who's on the right of it, we don't allow to drive a car, we don't allow to make decisions about their own lives, we look at people as being on a spectrum, a very diverse spectrum, and every single time look at their individual assessment of what they're able to do. A core part of the UNCRPD is the concept of reasonable accommodation. And again, the idea is that people should get necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments that do not impose a disproportionate or undue burden. So if somebody needs help in order to be treated with dignity, in order to be included in society, then they should get assistance to do that. And here, because I said that I did quite some research on India, I pulled up a recent case from the Supreme Court of India, which was Vikas Kumar versus the Union Public Services Commission. And Harshit and Akansha, you might know the UPSC. You probably have a bunch of friends who are preparing for the UPSC exams. So It's quite a big thing. So you might know the panic that a candidate may have if they enter the exam, they show up to the UPSC, and then their hand starts hurting. They get a writer's cramp, and they're not able to do the exam because their hand hurts. So in this case, which was in 2021, that candidate, he had such a pain in his hand and said, please, I need this one special pen. I want this one special stylus, and then I'll be able to write the exam. And the UPSC said, no, we're not going to give you that stylus. You won't get the pencil because your writer's cramp doesn't impair you to more than 40%. And your writer's cramp is not listed as a benchmark disability. And Vikas said, oh, no, I'm not accepting this. And he appealed, and he went all the way to the Supreme Court of India. And now the question is, how should the Supreme Court rule? The Supreme Court said that the reasoning of the UPSC was complete nonsense. And the Supreme Court sided and agreed with Vikas and allowed him to get a stylus and take the UPSC exam so that he can then be a civil servant. The Supreme Court said, well, just because it's not listed in a list means nothing, because the purpose of the Person with Disability Act, right, that the main Indian disability law, is to impose positive obligations and ensure that people can live equally. So the Supreme Court said you didn't do an individualized assessment, right? I've pointed that out repeatedly. Individual assessment is the key. You should have provided it immediately and not like years later. And also the burden is on the denying entity. So if the candidate, Vikas, asks for a stylus, he shouldn't have to prove that he is disabled enough. But instead, the entity, the UPSC, should have to prove that it's too much to ask of them. Like Vikas was asking for a pen. Is that really too much to ask? And that's what the Supreme Court drew on. And in this case, it was Justice Chandrachud, in case anybody cares. If I'm drunk tonight, I cannot sign a contract, but by tomorrow morning, I'll be sober again. And then I'll be able to sign a contract again. Similarly, there's some stuff that I should never, ever be trusted with. I should never, ever be trusted with building a, I don't know, space rocket scientist thing that goes to Mars or to the moon, simply because I just don't know how to do the mathematics in it. That doesn't mean that I'm not able to make decisions about other things. Like I could represent a client in court. I have the ability to do that. But if it comes to complex medical decisions, maybe I wouldn't be the best either. So similarly, a person with an intellectual disability may know what they want to wear in the morning. They may know that they want to wear the red dress instead of the blue dress, like you're on the picture, but wouldn't be able to make decisions about, I don't know, a plastic surgery to alter their looks. Or a person who lives in a hospital may know that they really don't like being there and they would like to go home. But they wouldn't be able to make a decision about buying a house or buying an apartment or whatnot. So again, there's always nuance in what people are actually able to do. And just because somebody has a disability doesn't mean that they're not able to do anything. One example that came up really, really often in my research was that of schizophrenic patients. So schizophrenia is a disorder, a mental disorder where people have delusions, hallucinations. So where they think that, for instance, their family is not actually their family, or that their family is secretly the CIA and surveilling them. Or with regards to hallucinations, they may think that there's ants or spiders crawling on their skins. So really, really nasty delusions and hallucinations. But even this isn't a fixed category. So even if they think on one day that the people who are trying to get them into a hospital for treatment are secretly from the Secret Service or who knows what, then that doesn't mean that the next day they would still be thinking the same thing. And that's because here's a nice little medical chart of what a schizophrenic episode looks like. It usually fluctuates quite a bit. So I'm going to just turn on the highlighter here, the laser pointer. Everything that's further up here is when the mental illness is doing well. And everything that's further down, if it goes down here, that means that the mental health is doing worse and the person is able to make less reliable decisions and is less able to understand their surroundings. So there could be a psychotic episode where all of a sudden they think that everybody's out to kill them, everybody's evil, nobody's to be trusted, but that can get better. And it usually does get better. So again, I'm bringing up the spectrum here, that every person has a different and fluctuating ability that totally depends on the day, task at hand, and that therefore this has been recognized in the UN CRPD, in the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So earlier, we used to talk, mental health lawyers, disability lawyers, human rights lawyers, lawyers in general, used to talk about so-called mental capacity and mental incapacity. And we still hear these terms quite a lot, but they're not accurate because it's not an all or nothing game. It's not either somebody's capable or incapable of living, but people have different capacities to do different things. So there's an emerging concept of legal capacity. And if you want to read more, I recommend the Ontario Law Commission's document from 2010. It's long, it's like 120 pages long, but it is quite lovely because they summarize or lay down in detail how you can ensure the right to legal capacity. And I say right to legal capacity because we are recognized as a person before the law because of our legal capacity. We are recognized as humans, as legal persons, and that means we have legal capacity. That means we have a right, we are allowed to participate fully in society. And the question then isn't, does a person have mental capacity to exercise their legal capacity? But what types of supports are required for a person to exercise their legal capacity? Said a lot of capacity repeatedly now, but long story short is that people have different abilities and we need to find supports so that they can make decisions like signing documents, buying a car, choosing medical care, so that they can get support to exercise their innate, inherent human legal capacity. So this is a quick link to my, you can't click on it, but you can look for my thesis. It's on ResearchGate, and it will be published hopefully soon in the International Journal of Mental Health and Capacity Law in a slightly shortened format, which is very exciting because it's going to be even more lovely, even more innovative, and looks at, the title is Untangling Domestic Human Rights Legislation Through the Eyes of Indian Psychiatrists. And what I did here in my research was I noticed that a lot of psychiatrists, a lot of doctors, a lot of medical professionals in general really didn't like mental health care law. They thought that it was a fuss, that it was annoying. And I talked to them and realized that they see extreme tensions between the right to health and the right to autonomy. So again, this entire disability rights thing has been about autonomy, right? About people making decisions for their own lives. At the same time, healthcare professionals really, really care about giving people healthcare. And if these two conflict, because a person's autonomy is respected to deny healthcare, then a psychiatrist will be really annoyed and really would like to give healthcare to the person that they think needs help. And I explore this tension over 30 pages. So you can look for that or just connect with me on Facebook. I've put my contact details in the chat, and then I'll send that to you. So to wrap it up, because we're almost done, is we talked about some paradigm shifts. That instead of talking about people being capable or incapable, we've started looking at what precisely people are struggling with and what precisely they need help with. Similarly, instead of talking about disabled and abled, we and the UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, say, well, everybody's differently abled, so what support is needed? The UNCRPD, because it is a human rights document, also takes a very rights-based approach. It says that access to services like healthcare, housing, education, work, that those are not charity, but a right. And finally, we have a paradigm shift away from disability as a medical fact to being a social construct. And this has crucial implications, because usually human rights are all about the state and the individual. What does the state owe the individual? And in this case, we actually have disability being constructed as a social thing where everybody needs to be on board and everybody needs to think differently about disability. So that is actually a huge burden on non-state actors too. Very last slide of mine is that we still have a long way to go. The UNCRPD has a mechanism for people to submit complaints. And there's been a bunch of complaints in the past few years. There's one in Australia from 2013 on a person being incarcerated / imprisoned / locked up because they had an intellectual impairment. There have been cases in Australia of people being denied a work visa for alleged medical reasons. We still have torture and ill treatment of people with alleged disabilities. And of course, a bunch of cases of hospitalization where people are just locked up, allegedly for their own good. We've come a long way. We've come from people being locked up, forcibly institutionalized, to forced experiments, medical experiments. In Nazi Germany, people with disabilities were killed so that they don't reproduce. The same in Sweden, people were sterilized. There's been dehumanization, sexual exploitation, hate crime, and we still have a lot of these happening today. So disability rights aren't guaranteed yet, just like every human rights thing, I think. And we still have a long way to go. And the UNCRPD is a way to remind us of what human rights are about, namely that everybody is equal.